Hello, listeners, and welcome to Burson India podcast. My name is Vandana Sandhir. I'm the Chief Client Strategy Officer at Burson Group India. Today's episode is particularly exciting as it marks our first podcast under our new identity as Burson. At this new journey for us at Burson, we believe that building reputation capital requires a deep understanding of societal and environmental issues, coupled with the ability to craft compelling narratives that resonate with diverse stakeholders. Amongst the new trends that are emerging, sustainability and ESG, environmental, social governance, has really grown into prominence in the recent years. And today's discussion is focused on that. Our Burson Sustainability and Social Impact team helps clients lead with purpose, drive innovation, and stand out on the global stage. It is my pleasure to welcome Michael Rhydderch, Head of Sustainability for Asia Pacific Burson, who will share his insights on how businesses can blend technical expertise with creative storytelling to exceed stakeholder expectations in this increasingly regulated and high stakes landscape. Welcome to the show, Mike. Great to have you.
Thanks, Vandana. It's great to be a part of it.
Mike, I'm going to start by asking you to tell us about yourself and how did you get into this field of sustainability and what is it that you do at Burson?
Yeah, sure. So I have been on a bit of a journey with my career within sustainability. I started off a long time ago now doing an environmental science degree. And after that, I did a postgraduate in science communication, which was, I guess, very relevant to where I'm at today, because it was all about how do you communicate kind of complex scientific topics to the wider audience, and actually have them engaged and have them kind of understanding and to drive action. And then I, sort of went down that education, community engagement route for a few years, and I moved over into sort of more of that technical sustainability space, helping companies sort of measure and map their carbon footprint across, their portfolios, helping them set, science-based net zero targets, and really kind of delving into that, I guess what you'd consider the E of the ESG. And then I was fortunate to be able to kind of expand that knowledge by becoming a B consultant, which is part of a global sustainability certification called B Corp. So that really gave me a lot of additional kind of insight into the social elements of ESG, as well as obviously, what good governance looks like. And since that time, I've really been working, across all industries, helping them understand their material, environmental and social impacts, how to build strong governance frameworks, and, obviously helping them meet, whether it's regulatory requirements or whether it's, from a reputational perspective, in terms of helping them meet, what the market is asking them. And, overall, the idea is to help them, be a better company for people and planet. And yeah, recently I've been fortunate now to find myself as the head of sustainability for Burson across APAC, which is really exciting. And I think what it feels like is a perfect culmination of my journey to date, where it's helping companies understand the technicalities of ESG as it becomes more technical, but also that really crucial, important part of communications, of the storytelling, of really, going beyond the numbers and kind of helping companies understand purpose and drive their sustainability actions and really kind of integrate it into their business. So it's been a really interesting journey, and I guess I'm excited, to be a part of Burson and what it leads to.
Wow, that's been a fantastic journey, Mike. And if I may say so, actually mirrored the rise of sustainability as a core function through this journey of yours. Let's dive straight in to get a better understanding of this vast world of sustainability and ESG. And how do you think organizations should really think about this area? As the mentor for ESG and sustainability in India, what I've observed is that ESG till recently was really seen as a compliance tick mark for companies here. But now it's slowly but surely becoming very core to how companies operate and create value. What do you think is driving this shift? And how does focusing on ESG have an impact on companies' reputation and its relationship with stakeholders over the long term?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think there's a lot of, I guess, key levers, I suppose you could say, that are happening right now that is really shifting it from a tick box exercise to actually a fully integrated, kind of concept. And I think, when we think about India and the regulations, if we look at the BRSR that has, only recently kind of been launched in India, what we're seeing there is that's a really strong shift in terms of what that ESG regulation is asking companies to undertake. And I think, what we're seeing in India, but also from a global perspective, is that ESG regulation is actually starting to reflect what the market has been asking for some time. And whether that be from investors or whether it be, bottom up from consumers, there has been, a growing expectation that companies have to identify what their environmental and social impacts are, both from a financial perspective to their business, but also externally in terms of the impact on people and planet. And I think now what we're seeing is that compliance is kind of catching up to that. So really, to adequately address what is being asked of in the BRSR, it's not a tick box exercise. You have to identify not just environmental impacts, but your social impacts, and be able to demonstrate what sort of governance you have as a business to address them. And it does take effort, and it does take the developing of policies and strategies as a business to be able to adequately address what's being asked of. And so I think that's one of the key drivers in terms of, whilst it does still feel like maybe a tick box exercise because we think of it as compliance, to actually meet these new regulations, whether it be in India, whether it be in the UK, whether it be in the EU, whether it be in Australia, New Zealand, or other countries across APAC, China. It's happening at a global scale, and it's becoming much more comprehensive and quantitative as well. So I think for companies to be able to get that information takes a lot more kind of effort. I think as beyond regulations, we're looking at, the pressures of global markets, and, whether it be, looking, for example, at the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, as it's called, and that's essentially putting a tax on emissions intensive materials that are coming into the EU. And so that has a huge impact from a global perspective for companies that sell a lot of their products into the EU. They either have a choice of being taxed, or they have a choice of trying to manufacture those materials that are more kind of emissions efficient. So that in itself it's hard, absolutely, but I guess the idea of it is to drive a kind of global decarbonisation. And I guess beyond that, we have global clients, we have multinational clients, and whilst they, may be headquartered somewhere else, they're looking at each of the markets that they operate in, and they're looking at how they can either meet the regulations or they can meet, the stakeholder expectations within that market. What I like to kind of communicate to a lot of companies, even if they're not regulated, is that it's very likely that their tier one customers are regulated. And what that means is that those customers are going to be asking their suppliers for information on their own environmental and social, risks and opportunities, and how they're assessing them, because they have to look at their entire value chain. And that's a really important feature here, is that because all of these large companies have to look at their value chain, all of the kind of ESG requirements, from a regulatory or from an investor perspective, are all going to be kind of pushed down the line to the suppliers, because they're going to have to provide that information as well. So I think that's a really important consideration, that even if a company is not, a listed company, or, what we call a large company that has to report, it's very likely that they're going to have to provide this information. And I think, from a kind of a financial risk perspective, access to capital, maintaining client relationships, it makes a lot of sense to really kind of go on that sustainability journey authentically. And then I think, kind of finally, like you touched on, Vandana, it's this reputational impact.
Right.
And I would probably argue that ESG reputation is much more kind of valuable or impactful than ESG regulation. If you're seen to not be doing the right thing within the market, then the market will respond. And if anything, that creates much more of a financial, risk. That reputational risk creates much more of a financial risk than you could consider a regulatory risk does. And so, as we're seeing that kind of growing customer expectation, the growing kind of broader stakeholder expectation, that is going to continue to play out and ramp up. There's a really interesting study that was done a few years ago that showed that a company's value, 90% of a company's value, is tied up in intangible assets. So, think of other forms of capital, not just financial capital, but reputational capital, intellectual capital, natural capital. Historically, investors, capital providers would look to companies' hard assets like property, plant, equipment, before deciding whether or not to invest money into that business. But now they look at other forms like patents and technology and reputation, and how a company's essentially framing their sustainability journey. So I think, by and large, we're shifting from this idea of a tick box exercise and companies only do it because they want to be a nice company to the idea that sustainability is not a green or a moral conversation anymore. It's actually a competitiveness conversation.
Sure, Mike, you make some very strong points, and I love the point about strengthening and focusing on intangible assets and how that's a priority for companies today. But you have to admit, Mike, that there is a fair sense of skepticism around ESG and its impact on business, right? We are still convincing businesses on why they need to stay committed. So what would your message be? How do you see this sentiment playing out? And how is it that companies can do much more in tackling climate challenges rather than just sticking to doing their part and getting over with it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you do raise a really good point in that all of this makes sense, and there's information and there's data that shows the benefits of having a strong ESG framework over companies that don't, and the increased resilience. But you're right in that we're still having to kind of have these conversations about why it's a good thing to do. And I think to some degree there's still, I guess, shift in the kind of the systemic market that we have to change, and that's this kind of concept of competitive sustainability. There's still this kind of tug of war between profitability and sustainability, right. And that's where we really need to see government policies that essentially incentivize the increase of sustainable kind of manufacturing of products, for example, versus a company that's manufactured a product in a kind of a BAU way. So, a company that goes to the effort of embedding, more recycled content and not using virgin material and, reducing the energy intensity of their manufacturing process and kind of does all these right things and, allows products to be returned and repaired and those sorts of actions. There needs to be a system that kind of rewards companies for doing that and incentivizes companies for doing it. And I think that we are getting there. You look at the ESG regulations, and I know it is such a new space, and for some companies it hasn't even kicked in yet, and still some countries are introducing them. But I think in the next 5 years, when these things have been going for a few years, what we're going to see is that companies are going to start to realize that unless they actually integrate, like that's essentially what the regulations are asking for. They're asking for that sort of to demonstrate that kind of circularity, whether it be in a service that you're providing, whether it be in a product. And I think that the regulations have kind of finally caught up. And now when we start to see that roll out for a few years, I think we're going to see that market shift to this kind of idea of competitive sustainability. But I think that is still, going to take a couple of years to get to that kind of systemic change that we need to see. That point that we're trying to prove, I think that removing the barriers that companies may face. And, I think that, companies are nervous about greenwashing. Companies are nervous about saying something, and they're nervous about getting penalized. And and they're nervous about, saying the wrong thing. And I think that's where, that kind of communications expertise that comes into play in terms of being able to provide that kind of understanding of the technicality, but also the importance of transparency in all of your communications that then drives that credibility. I think it's okay to not know everything, and I think that's where a lot of organizations get a bit nervous and they think they have to have all of the answers. And I think it's really about being able to kind of remove those barriers, particularly at the leadership level, to say it is okay to not know everything about, whatever the sustainability issue is, whether it's climate, whether it's, a particular energy or water or waste issue. What's important is making decisions based on the information that you have and being transparent about how you've come to those conclusions, and acknowledging that if new information or a new way of undertaking a certain task comes to light, then you're going to go down that road and you're going to kind of update that information. And I think what the market wants to see, what investors want to see, what regulators want to see, what customers want to see is companies being aggressive in terms of the sustainability commitments that they have, but also being transparent about, how they're getting there and the progress that they're making. And I think the market rewards that transparency. The market rewards essentially saying, listen, we know that you're making decisions based off the information that you got, and we understand that. And I think that takes a level of leadership and takes a level of kind of education to make businesses comfortable with essentially what they don't know.
Sure, I think that makes so much sense. And clearly, there's no looking back, and sustainability and ESG is critical, and companies have to adapt to these new realities. To all our listeners, this is the end of part 1 of the podcast. Stay tuned for the next one.